Good afternoon, everyone. Sawadee ka. Assalamualaikum. Welcome to Plenary Session 5, Climate Change from Inconvenient Truth to Incontrovertible Fact. I am Liz Abanto, your moderator for this session. Global discussions have been ongoing, actually, on the state of climate change. And the ambition was to secure a global net zero and keep global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. As we all know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change August report on climate change has raised already the alarm to code red for humanity. Most countries were hopeful that the COP26, or the Conference of Parties, which ended last November 12, will be a success in getting leaders to commit to concrete measures to abet the worsening climate emergency. However, the conclusion of the summit disappointed small and developing countries over the softening of critical language regarding coal power, phasing down instead of phasing out. The agreement was also said to have left unresolved issues on how much and how swiftly each nation must reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. Zooming in on what countries know about climate change and how they can contribute to climate change action, allow me to briefly share a survey conducted by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication on international public opinion on climate change, which was conducted between February 17 to March 3, 2021 among Facebook users in 31 countries. The study revealed that half of the 31 countries, mostly from developed countries, have a moderate level of knowledge on climate change. Meanwhile, some respondents from Asian countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, India, and Thailand reported that they have never heard of climate change. Yet some respondents believe that these countries are already experiencing climate change, and that it is mostly caused by natural changes in the environment. There is a clamor for more information on climate change. Respondents, meanwhile, from the Philippines, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia said they're worried about climate change and that their government should place higher priority on acting on climate change. Most expressed willingness to participate in a citizens' campaign to reduce greenhouse gas. Lastly, respondents from the Philippines, Vietnam, Taiwan, and India were classified as alarmed, while those from Indonesia and Thailand were described as simply concerned. On AMIC's Day 2 parallel session on climate change, researchers presented their studies and analysis of the media coverage. And in China, for instance, they say more than half of the quoted news sources were coming from political officials. And only 19% were from experts and fewer from ordinary citizens and national government organizations. More of this delved on policies which were perceived to serve the legitimacy of the Chinese government and promoting a positive image, rather than presenting concrete measures to address environmental problems. In the Philippines, the researchers said the Filipino journalists were described as striving to maintain their ideals of objectivity while shaping the narratives according to their own agenda. Now, amid this backdrop, let us hear from three distinguished speakers on how we should make sense about our current state of response to climate change. Allow me to present to you the first speaker. Jonathan Lin is head of communications and media relations at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Before joining the IPCC in November 2011, he worked as a foreign correspondent and editor for Reuters news agency for 32 years, reporting from over 30 countries around the world. Jonathan is an MA from Cambridge University, where he studied modern languages at Clare College. He is a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and is currently the Senior Communications Advisor at the IPCC. Friends, please welcome Jonathan Lin. Sir, your microphone, please.
Yep. Thank you very much, Fleur-de-Lys. And just a quick update to my bio. I actually retired from the IPCC on Tuesday, but I'm continuing to support the IPCC as a consultant, senior communications advisor, as we continue to roll out a series of sixth assessment report over the next few months. Well, as we know, climate change is one of the biggest risks faced by societies, economies, communities, and how it's communicated is very important for the policy response and for behavioral change. We now see that both extreme weather and slow onset changes such as sea level rise pose dangers to infrastructure and to communities. How we handle this is a challenge to industries such as insurance that help manage risk. Now, I'm going to talk today from the perspective of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was founded in 1988 to assess climate science. In other words, to look at all the research relating to climate change produced every year and tell policymakers, that's governments at all levels, this is what we know about climate change, what we don't know, where scientists differ, and where more research is needed. And this enables governments to make policy at the national level or in international negotiations based on the evidence of science. Now, the IPCC doesn't do our own original research. We inform people about the state of knowledge on climate change. Because we assess all science in an objective way, and because we prepare our reports in a co-design process endorsed by all governments and the scientific community, IPCC assessments enjoy enormous credibility and authority. We are the reference point. And IPCC reports are specifically designed to help policymakers and others conduct risk assessments. Some of the challenges we face in communicating about climate change are the same as you see in communicating any complex subject, such as health or finance. There's a lot of technical language, scientific jargon, abbreviations and acronyms used by insiders that are barriers to understanding by non-specialists. We work hard to train our experts to avoid such language when talking to non-specialists. For instance, we say, imagine you're explaining this to your mother or your grandmother or your children. Avoid terms such as mitigation. But the risks here are much greater than you might suppose. We use terminology and words every day in our discussions on the subject that we think are absolutely clear and normal, but we're wrong. One new study by experts at the University of Southern California, Dornsife, that appeared in the recent special issue of the journal Climatic Change, which is devoted to IPCC communications, looked at how people in America understand some key terminology selected by our scientific leadership as relevant to the reports they were working on. For instance, in climate change, we talk about adaptation all the time, how people, agriculture, wildlife are adjusting to the climate change that is already happening. It's a basic term featuring in the names of committees, conferences, organizations. But the people surveyed did not think of it primarily as something to do with climate change, but as the process of turning a book into a movie, adaptation. Similarly, the concept of sustainable development, which is an essential part of the framing of all our reports, and indeed underlies all the work of the United Nations, is seen as being something to do with real estate, development, perhaps with some eco-friendly aspects. Now, typically, scientific reports are worded quite subtly and not like newspaper articles. There may be careful nuances, disclaimers, consideration of different scenarios. But the general public, especially activists, want clear messages that point the way forward. Of course, this demand can pose the risk that scientists are under pressure to exaggerate or oversimplify, go beyond scientific conclusions, become prescriptive or fall into alarmism. Our scientists are very aware of these risks, as well as the opposite danger of being too conservative, although that's perhaps the lesser of the two evils. We in the communications team understand this too. Only communications approaches that uphold integrity and credibility of science can succeed. You cannot simply take a report prepared by scientists and hand it to the communications specialists to translate. The scientists must work on the communications aspects from the start, fully responsible for substance, but guided by communications experts on how it's presented. We now invest a huge effort with the scientists on this. It originated in media training, helping them handle media interviews, but soon developed into a more fundamental process where the scientists take responsibility for developing the messaging around their reports. A good example of this is the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees that came out in 2018 in response to a request in the 2015 Paris Agreement. That report is over 600 pages. Like all IPCC reports, it includes a summary for policymakers of 20 to 30 pages, a high-level document finalized together by the government representatives and scientists in an approval session of the IPCC. But going beyond this, two leading scientists on the report independently came to the same summary. Every bit of warming matters. Every year matters. Every choice matters. Now this is a very powerful tool as well as a perfect summary of what's in the report. It contributed to the then unprecedented interest in climate change, galvanizing public awareness about the subject. The fact this report came out as the global youth protests such as Friday for the Future were emerging helped its reception. The report we released 4 months ago in early August, which Fjordalis just mentioned, the first part of the 6th assessment report, also encountered massive interest. We found it hard at times to respond to the demand for interviews and speakers. Sadly, this report fell on fertile territory given the various extreme weather events we have suffered all over the world in recent months, which for many people are a first-hand confirmation that climate is changing here and now. But I think it's fair to say we have passed a tipping point in public awareness of climate change. Everyone knows about it and the risks, whereas a few years ago it was too obscure or toxic to discuss in politics. Now it tops the global and national agenda. I'd like to talk about a couple of specific challenges. One is the use of uncertainty language. When the IPCC says something is very likely or more likely than not to happen, it is using a very specific language where the scientists conducting the assessment are looking at the level of agreement in the scientific literature, as well as the general likelihood of something happening. While report conclusions, at least in the summary for policymakers, tend to focus on medium or high likelihood uncertainty, policymakers also need to know about low likelihood, high impact events for their planning and allocation resources. Many scientific studies have shown this language is not understood uniformly by non-specialists, even when the report includes a key linking the terms to different percentages. This is strange because most people have a good understanding of risk in their personal lives, whether it be crossing a road, insuring their home, or getting on a plane. This is an area where communications scientists, drawing on cognitive psychology and the social sciences, may be able to give us guidance in the future to improve things. Communications scientists have shown us how different images and framings can help us reach out to diverse audiences, even those who are skeptical about climate change or the proposed solutions. While some of this goes beyond the mandate of the IPCC, it is framed in a scientific approach and language that speaks to our own scientists. Some of the specific challenges we face go back to that pressure for simplicity that I mentioned earlier. For instance, a lot of the public discussion around global warming suggests that people think that 1.5 degrees is the safe limit, and anything above that is a disaster. But 1.5 degrees is a political target set by governments on their reading of the science. It's not a recommendation by the IPCC. In fact, warming of 1.5 degrees already brings many bad impacts too, as we are starting to see with warming now of 1.1 degrees. But they would be even worse at higher levels, even those levels only slightly higher. Similarly, many people understood the 1.5 degree report to be warning of a precipice in the year 2030, when it said warming would reach 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2052 if it continued to increase at the current rate, and that pathways that keep warming to 1.5 degrees over the century would see emissions decline by 45% by 2030 from 2010 levels, reaching net zero around 2050. This led to a meme, given that the report came out in 2018, of 12 years to save the planet. But 2030 is simply a milestone on a pathway, and if it's missed, it's not game over, but a sign that further efforts will be needed to reach that target, perhaps taking longer than originally hoped. Now, it's important for the IPCC to rebut misleading representations of its reports, although that goes beyond its mandate to engage in general discussions about climate change. Here, the broader scientific and NGO community can play an important role. It's also important for the IPCC to clarify misunderstandings of how the IPCC works. For instance, a leading news organization recently ran a story saying that governments were lobbying IPCC scientists to water down some of the conclusions of the report. In fact, as we had to point out to them, we actually invite our member governments to take part in formal reviews of the draft reports as part of the formal process of preparing the report. The report authors have to respond to every comment they receive this way, but they're not obliged to follow them. The drafts, comments, and responses are all published in the interests of transparency. I'd like to talk a little about deniers in this context. When I first started my job 10 years ago, deniers were quite active, spreading confusion about climate science and trying to undermine the credibility of the IPCC and climate scientists in general. They seem to have largely faded into irrelevance now, talking to each other in their bubble. But with the huge impact of our latest reports and the greater salience of climate change on social media, they're becoming more active again. For instance, in the last few weeks during the COP26 climate conference, we were asked to fact-check some social media posts denying absolutely basic knowledge, claiming, for instance, that there'd been no climate change in the last 2 decades. There have been some signs that people who spread misinformation on social media about COVID and vaccines are starting to diversify into climate change denial. But as the discussion around climate change moves increasingly into the measures needed to address it, rather than just establishing the facts of climate change and its causes, we're seeing a lot of effort on blogs, social media, and think tanks to promote a delay of response measures rather than outright denial of the facts. I'd like to finish by talking about some of the successes the IPCC has had in communications. The IPCC's previous big report, the 5th assessment, which came out in 2013 and 2014, was the main scientific input into COP21 in 2015, arguably providing the scientific momentum for the Paris Agreement. I already mentioned the transforming impact of the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees in 2018. And I mentioned the huge response to the first part of the 6th assessment report in August. This certainly contributed to what progress there was at COP26 in Glasgow last month. Even if we are far from the trajectory many would like to be on, COP26 showed governments increasingly pledging action, pushed by scientists who are inspired by the science. Pushed by citizens who are inspired by the science. I'll stop here, and I look forward to taking some questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sir Jonathan Lin. Okay, you just presented to us like how difficult it was to communicate climate change from, how the scientists should communicate that in a way that more people could get to understand it. The bigger challenge is in fact is not just translating or using simpler words, but how do you make those words relatable to a particular culture, not just a dialect, but cultural practices. So we'll get back to you later on. So we would like to encourage all our participants to please start jotting down your questions. You can write them in the chat box. I would request the help of our our tech support, to please provide me the questions later on, which you would like to ask Mr. Jonathan Lin. And of course, he left us hanging there with how COP26 will have an impact on IPCC, or the other way around, and how it's going to affect all our responses, especially from the Asian countries. Thank you very much, and I'll see you again, Mr. Lin. All right, next on our list is a person who has probably been read and used in your classes. His works have been made popular in DEFCON courses or classes because he had been, excuse me for a while, he had been has written a lot of books on how we should look at development communication. Dr. Jan Servais has been a UNESCO chair in communication for sustainable social change and was the chairperson of the Scientific Committee for the World Congress on Communication for Development. He has taught international communication and communication for social change in Australia, Belgium, China, Hong Kong, the United States, the Netherlands, and Thailand, where he is right now, in addition to several teaching stints at about 120 universities in 55 countries. Dr. Jan has undertaken research, development, and advisory work around the world, and is the author of several journal articles and books on such topics as international and development communication, ICT and media policies, intercultural communication, participation and social change, and human rights and conflict management. He is known for his multiplicity paradigm in communication for development, one world, multiple cultures. Friends, please welcome Dr. Jan Servais.
Please unmute. Dr. Jan.
Yes, okay. Hello, everybody. Here I am, but I can't see myself, so I doubt whether you can see me. Can you?
Yes, sir. You're already visible to all of us. And so is your
that's
slide.
great. Okay, that's even better. Okay, then I'll ignore what I see, but I'll take it that you can follow the presentation which I prepared through PowerPoint. Okay, I'm very pleased that I was invited for this occasion because this is indeed a very important topic at this particular time in the ongoing discussion about climate change and what to do about it. And I think that we as communication scholars have a lot to contribute, although unfortunately, as often is the case, we are basically ignored in the international arena of policy and decision-making institutions. So the topic of my presentation, as you can see, is Mayday, Mayday, we are drowning. Roger, over and out. The first sentence or line refers to the emergency signal which is used by boats and by aircraft when they are facing emergency issues. And the answer normally is, Roger, we understood, and let's try to do something about it. But in this particular case, I think that the best answer would be, Roger, over and out. We've understood, but we are not going to do much about it. And that's unfortunately what I have come up as a conclusion after following the COP26 this year. Climate change is definitely not the only problem we are facing these days, but it's one of the major ones. And can we go to the next slide, please? Today we are encountered with a lot of problems. I mentioned climate change as the first, but of course we are still suffering or adjusting ourselves to COVID-19. We are constantly faced through media reports, etc., that there is a lot of migration taking place these days, and not always migrations of people who are keen on moving or happy to move or invited over into the countries they want to migrate to. There are, of course, also issues with food security, economic issues, disruption at the international finance and trade level, the erosion of human rights as a consequence. And then I last mentioned COP26, which I think is basically a flop, but that's something we may discuss at a later stage. So all these issues altogether create a lot of tensions, create a lot of issues, and it's very difficult to handle those in a integrated, systematic way. So my next slide, please, basically says, so what? Because most of us realize that it's very difficult to deal with these issues. So then let me take one example in this area, and as I already mentioned to drowning, let me take the issue of flooding in the country I'm currently stuck in, because I cannot move back to Europe for a number of reasons. Vaccination is one of them. But so the issue of flooding in Thailand is very real. When I lived here in the 80s, I know from people I spoke to in those days, consultants and business people, that the government was trying to foresee this particular issue already in those days. Reports were produced, recommendations made, governments or cabinets discussed those and came up with some solutions even. But unfortunately, much of what was taking place in those days, at the time that a lot of the flooding issues could have been handled in a more structural and long-term perspective, they disappeared in what is known around here as the black hole of corruption. So here we are in 2011, 10 years ago, and Thailand suffered its first, or in this time and age, it's a major flooding situation. These are pictures of the 2011 situation. And they realized that this is not going away, that this will have to be dealt with in a much more systematic way. In a bit of context, next slide, please. We already saw in those days that research indicated that apart from countries in Europe, especially the Netherlands, but the Netherlands is a special case because they are basically, for the major part, living under the sea level. So, but they also have handled that in a pretty straightforward, sustainable way, building dams and preparing communities for all the eventualities. In the other part of the globe, the area we are living in, Asia, it's considered to be also a major issue, and especially the countries around here, Thailand, Vietnam, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Japan, they are the countries which are going to suffer from major flooding have already done so, but will continue doing so if they don't really come up with major sustainable long-term solutions. Next slide, please. And that has increased as a problem. This is the latest, largest annual study of the impacts of climate change on human health, done by The Lancet, the famous academic journal. And they identified 10 countries that are most affected by extreme weather events. And as you can see, the highlighted ones, Myanmar, Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Thailand, and Nepal are among those 10, which are listed as countries in need of relief and support. Now, focusing then on Thailand, next slide. We already showed you the pictures of 2011. Here are some snapshots about Bangkok. where in 2015 already one said that Bangkok will be submerged in 15 years time. That means 2030, and there is on the right hand side an explanation of why Bangkok is vulnerable, is probably going to be not going to be saved, because it's not only a one issue, but there are many factors involved in this particular sinking of Bangkok. Next slide, please. So in 2017, and that's not the first time I just present this because it's some time ago, the Bangkok Post presented a major opinion piece on the sinking of Bangkok, written by one of the cabinet consultants in those days, which stated a comprehensive water management plan must become the nation's top priority. We need to create more sustainable long-term solutions. We need campaigns to raise awareness and strong law enforcement on this matter. But unfortunately, next one, please. That hasn't happened, it seems, because today we are faced with more or less similar situation as in 2011. Next, please. The Bangkok Post presented a slide just recently where they showed that the flooded areas in Thailand are as vast as they were in 2011. Only there is less coverage about this because Bangkok, as you can see, is not yet flooded as extensively as it was in 2011. So media don't pay that much attention to the current flooding situation, or they have, of course, focused, like in many parts of the world, on other issues like the COVID pandemic. But that's not going away. And next slide, please. We'll see that the projection for 2030 is very problematic. The reddish parts are the ones which will be submerged by then, and that's not only Bangkok in Thailand, but that's parts of Bangladesh, that's part of Vietnam, and higher up, as you can see, also part of China. That's a projection, but it's a very evidence-based or based on factual analysis projection. Now let me make a slide move to our field, communication science. Next slide, please. I, and together with me, quite a number of academics have always paid a lot of attention to the issue of climate change. And for instance, in 2015, we organized a conference in which we highlighted and focused on climate change as an important challenge for our scientific group. We listed a couple of questions. I just read a few. How do you make a complex subject like sustainable development or climate change simple and understandable to a general audience? What kinds of messages have you used that successfully motivated and engaged people to care about sustainable development or climate change? How do we bridge the gap between communication for social change, awareness, and action? If you would go back to the first slide, you'll see there a book presented on the Asian Sustainable Development Goals in Asia. In that book, some of the findings, some of the recommendations of this conference have been listed and can be consulted. But next slide, please. We, in most of our work, and again, it's not only me, it's a team effort with collaborations with other consultants and students and people. We have always argued that a certain kind of development communication can assist and solve, at least try to, deal with complex issues such as sustainable development and climate change. And here we list a couple of these reasons and ways of looking at it. We are going to move on. Next slide, please. And by way of a summary, so to speak, our argument would be that these principles, these ways of looking at it, can focus on at least three aspects, three cornerstones. It needs to be based on facilitating participation. It needs to make information understandable and meaningful, and it needs to foster policy acceptance. It takes into account the needs and capacities of all concerned through the integrated and participatory use of communication processes, media, and channels. But unfortunately, that's an ideal way of positioning it, and those in communication science also know that most of what is going on in communication is not always focusing on these particular perspectives of integrated and participatory use of communication processes, media, and channels. In my own work, next slide, please, I've therefore summarized, next. I summarized this under, one back, please. Thank you. In five components, communication strategies for sustainable development, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The first three, also highlighted in red, they are the ones most commonly used in our field. And unfortunately, my argument, and I can document that in research output, has always been that these are in itself important and interesting, but they don't really contribute to sustainable social change or long-term solutions for climate change. It's only at the fourth and the fifth level that we can start speaking about attempts, contributions to solutions for these complex issues: participatory communication and community mobilization, and communication for structural and sustainable social change, which uses a combination of different media and different approaches. And I can further document that in my next slide, where we summarize some of the work done in our field by UN agencies, governmental agencies, and NGOs. And we've listed in such a way that the ones on the top, extension, diffusion of innovations, are the more traditional, linear ways of looking at these problems. The ones at the bottom, community participation, are much more participatory, democratic, and dialogical, so to speak. But again, there is also a hybridity in between, and there are always things which can be adopted and connected as a result. Next slide. But to summarize that argument, we would say that much of what is going on in communication for social change is not really creating sustainable development, is not contributing to solving complex issues like climate change. For that to happen, we need to include a more contextual, a more structural way of looking at things. And we've listed there some of these factors: structural and conjunctural factors, service provision, education system, socio-demographic, socio-political, including the physical environment, which is also very important. Now, by way of conclusion, you could say, okay, then let's aim for an implementation or advocacy for sustainable development goals. And that in itself is definitely an approach which we and I personally have been taken over the years. But the more we look into the issue of sustainable development goals, we are also encountered with some of the issues and some of the problems we've already identified at earlier stages in the discussion. So next, please. One of the The interesting approaches these days is the discussion on global sustainable competitiveness indexes, and they use 5 different components: governance, intellectual capital, natural capital, social capital, and resource efficiency. And there is, as you can see, a bit of a combination of natural, material, but also immaterial, governance-based ways of looking at sustainability and competitiveness, which is important to come up with conclusions or recommendations. And you may assume that the COP26 had to do something similar. But of course, in the final analysis, COP26 and many of these international conferences and get-togethers are all dominated by, so to speak, governance and political decision-making, which is not always the best way to reach recommendations and conclusions. Back to Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. We know that we've moved away from the 8 Millennium Development Goals to a listing of 17 currently Sustainable Development Goals. And one is now assessing whether all these goals will and can be met by 2030, because that's also the deadline given for this discussion. There are strong indications that many of these goals will not be met. And one was at the primary stages, at the start of the discussion, hopeful that at least end poverty and end hunger, the goal 1 and 2, would be achieved by 2030. Unfortunately, and that's the latest information about these discussions. Next slide, please. Another research group has analyzed this, researched this, and comes up with a commitment to reducing inequality, CRI, for meeting the Sustainable Development Goal to eliminate poverty. Whether that's possible at the world level, and the answer is no, and you can see it in the table. There are countries which may reach that goal of eliminating poverty and ending hunger, but these countries tend to be based in Europe. At the bottom, you'll see Thailand, Vietnam, Nepal, Singapore, China. They are not really at the stage that one could argue or that we could see improvement in this regard. So even the 2 goals which were highlighted as the ones we could easily achieve by 2030, and of course, in itself, it's a longer discussion than what we have today, but this discussion is probably going to be very problematic the closer we come to 2030. So to summarize and to identify a couple of questions for the future, what are the major challenges facing the UN Sustainable Development Goals, including the ones on climate change? First, how can we bring together the right stakeholders at the right time in the right place? Was COP26 one of those places with the right stakeholders? Question mark. Second, how do we make difficult trade-offs? Because it's not easy to aim for one goal and omit the needs for another goal, so to speak. Third, how do we build in accountability and transparency for it? Fourth, how to organize this in a participatory and democratic way. And fifth, and that's one of the issues I and my team or the people I'm working with are currently focusing on, we need a so-called 18th Sustainable Development Goal, communication for all, because that's, in our opinion, the one which is lacking in the current listing of Sustainable Development Goals, and one which is very important and crucial to satisfy, to accomplish the positive achievement of the other goals. Next slide is an invitation for further reading. And the next slide is a thank you to all of you. Thank you.
Kapun ka, Dr. Jan Servais. Okay, he has just presented to us a very holistic approach in understanding how we are communicating climate change and how we are to understand actions by our governments, not just governments, but our own individuals towards climate change. He left for us actually several pointers on what we as academicians could probably research on. Again, we have to take note that the success of our nations in addressing climate change depend a lot on a couple of things. The political conditions in our respective countries and the leadership. Is this in their agenda? And if, like in the Philippines, we're about to have our elections, we should make it as one of the deciding factors in selecting our future presidents. Number two, of course, he mentioned that, we should look at not only the physical sciences, but we look at social sciences, the behavior, and account for what perhaps is causing further the knowledge gap. And he proposes that we should really make sure that when policies are crafted and worked on, there is dialoguing and participation of all stakeholders. So thank you very much again, once again, Dr. Jan, and we will be back with you with all the possible questions from all your DEFCOM students listening to you right now. And we will hear that after the third presenter. Our third presenter this afternoon is the Dean's Chair Professor in Communication from the School of Communication, Journalism and Marketing from Massey University, New Zealand. He is the director of the Center for Culture-Centered Approach to Research and Evaluation, or CARE, developing culturally centered community-based projects of social change, advocacy, and activism that articulate health as a human right. Our third speaker, Dr. Mohan Dutta's research examines the role of advocacy and activism in challenging marginalizing structures, the relationship between poverty and health, political economy of global health policies, and the ways in which participatory culture-centered radical democracy serve as axis of global social change. Friends, please welcome Dr. Mohan Dutta.
Kia ora koto katoa. Thank you so much for having me here. I want to begin by acknowledging the indigenous people of Rangitane on whose land this university sits, and the expulsion of whom forms the basis of the knowledge claims I'm going to make today. I also want to begin by acknowledging many indigenous peoples and activists that are part of this work that I'm going to share. And I'm really going to make a very simple argument that the solutions to climate change lie in the hands of communities that have historically and systematically been erased by hegemonic structures. So the question for us that lies ahead is, how do we really deconstruct, decolonize, dismantle the whiteness that forms the infrastructure of communication, and that actually has historically worked through erasing indigenous and local communities and indigenous and local ways of knowing from the global south. So I will present to you first the concept of communicative inequalities and the ways in which that shapes the hegemonic approach to climate change communication. Within that backdrop, I will then discuss the culture-centered approach and then articulate decolonization as a framework for us to look forward in climate change communication. So the dominant model of climate change communication continues to embody that deficit-based model of communication. So Jan talked earlier about Rogers and the diffusion of innovations model. The framework continues to be that communities exist in deficit, and that we are going to fill them up with information. We are going to measure their attitudes, behavioral intentions, opinions, and then we are going to just create the right kind of frame of messaging in order to change them. And of course, when you situate this within the context of the global south, particularly when you look at the large-scale inequalities in terms of the effects and the risks and the burdens of climate change that are borne globally, that the South disproportionately bears the burden of climate change risks because of practices that are largely located within the infrastructures of colonialism and capitalism. So when we think about the overarching framework, then much of climate change communication projects Global South as deficit, as lacking. So you see studies or surveys done in the Philippines, in India, in Malaysia, in Thailand, among brown-skinned, black-skinned people who apparently don't have the knowledge about climate change and therefore need to be educated in the right kind of way. So this is what I talk about is the whiteness of the hegemonic model of communication that continues to reproduce an arrogant, white way of thinking, continuing to portray communities at the margins as existing in deficit, as primitive, as backward, and therefore needing to be emancipated by the white emancipator. So this unfortunately continues to play out in the dominant framework of climate change communication, and completely sort of erases the evidence that speaks to the white hegemonic way of doing things that constitutes the climate catastrophe that we are in the midst of. So there are some elements of this broad framework that we need to be attentive to. One is its emphasis on behaviorism, as if individual behaviors that are a linear product of attitudes and beliefs, and then those can be changed by shifting attitudes and beliefs, even though we systematically see, if we look at the broader evidence based on the literature, that effect sizes of message-based campaigns seeking to shift attitudes are actually fairly small, and that too are usually not sustained. This is complemented by an individualistic approach that blames the individual for the behavior. So it is, for instance, the person living in poverty in the global south that is responsible for the poor behavior and therefore needs to be changed through messaging, and simultaneously erasing the broader kinds of structural issues that constitute the threats to climate. So what really are the structural issues that constitute the threat to climate? First and foremost, that we see through our work is the extractive nature of capital, particularly as global capital continues to find ways of profiteering, and as it continues to run out of resources to exploit, it targets indigenous land, forests as the last frontiers of exploitation that it can include into these logics of capital. So this process then is one of colonial expulsion that is built into whiteness, and how whiteness seduces itself in the contemporary context is by co-option of culture and participation. So it uses the language of culture, it uses the language of bottom-up participation, while actually pushing forth capitalist privatized solutions that continue to erase, expel indigenous and local communities from their spaces of life and livelihood. And what is really ironic here is that in the midst of the co-option of participation and voice, you also see the dramatic rise in violence deployed by the military, violence deployed by the police, violence deployed by the authoritarian state that actually enable these extractive processes. So, and here again, there is something powerful in terms of the rhetoric of whiteness that, it turns the lens onto particular rogue regimes so that it can then frame these as primitive behaviors of the global south. So the global south cannot manage itself, so it really cannot have democracy, while actually it is sort of the networks of transnational capital that enable these infrastructures, and these processes of authoritarian governance deploying violence actually enable the flow of the global networks of capital. And in this backdrop, you also see the massive growth of platform colonialism, particularly in terms of the consolidation of participation and democracy in platforms, which are some of the most powerful source of profiteering today. And platforms work within this sense then to dismantle democracies, to threaten participation, to destroy the participatory possibilities of communities. And alongside then this, the final point I would raise on this slide is you see the ongoing corporatization of sustainability and turning sustainability into an investment logic. So you have a sustainability index that then can be sold in the market in terms of actually for people to know whether they're investing sustainably or not. And again, holding up a capitalist logic without really interrogating that underlying infrastructure. So this is shaped by, and this is what I argue in my work, by fundamental communicative inequalities, which is inequalities in the distribution and ownership of information resources and resources for voice, where communities can have voice in shaping those solutions for sustainability. So this is our work with, oppressed caste women farmers, this image that you see on the screen, who sort of have worked on indigenous agriculture, particularly in terms of indigenous seed saving techniques as ways for responding to climate change. So, turning to local ways of knowing about climate resistant crops, climate adaptive crops, that actually communities have grown within their local contexts. But once they do that, it is also about then foregrounding the logic of seed as something to be shared in the communities through the seed banks. So in this image, you see that they're carrying these bullock carts, and the bullock carts have these seeds in them. And as they go from village to village, they give out the seeds freely. And what that is doing is that is resisting the neoliberal market-based logic of agriculture. So this form of climate adaptation is also a response to the co-optation of climate change processes by foundations like Gates Foundations that use the climate change infrastructure to create new forms of markets for new technologies that then are to be deployed and disseminated in communities in the global south. So this fundamental form of seed sharing actually also resists this hegemonic capitalist infrastructure of whiteness bringing in solutions into the community. So community-owned knowledge as the basis of climate change then thinks of participation not just as a tool for disseminating the solutions of whiteness and the solutions of development produced from the global north to serve the interests of capital, but rather to really think about how do we move the infrastructures of knowledge generation into communities who know very well the challenges of climate change because they have been negotiating them. It's really interesting because I was talking to a colleague, they were doing a survey, with women in the global south and them responding to the survey. And it turns out in the survey, when you measure it, that their knowledge of climate change is very low. Well, that's because your instrument and the survey by which you're measuring their knowledge of climate change is shaped within the colonizing structure of whiteness. So within that structure, communities sort of emerge as in deficit. But actually, when you look at the lived experiences of communities in the global south, particularly in the hot zones of the global south, they're already negotiating climate change. They're living with the effects of climate change. They are facing the effects of the climate change when the weather patterns are changing dramatically and their crops are not sustaining or they face crop failure. So these are everyday lived realities. So the question for us is, how do we turn to the theory generative capacities of communities as generators of knowledge? How do we turn to community ownership of democracy and democracy as a process of democratizing knowledge? So in this context, you see the women that are planning the planting season in the fields. And what they're doing is they're collectively deciding based on evidence that they have gathered how they are going to plant the seeds in the next season. And this becomes the basis in this work for a pedagogy of democracy rooted in this idea that knowledge first and foremost needs to be democratized. Now, one of the things that the women farmers, and they're organized into these collectives of cooperatives called sanghams, they realize is that to tell their story of knowledge, that they have to fundamentally invert the hegemonic communication infrastructures and turn the infrastructures of storytelling into their hands. So through community-based video, through community radio, they are able to tell the story of their knowledge, but also they're able to create practical interventions through that. So the way I see climate change communication then, particularly from the framework of the Global South, is one of decolonization. And decolonization in terms of interrogating the dominant meanings of development, of climate, of health, that are rooted in the notions of whiteness, that are embedded in the interplays of colonialism and capitalism, and that are fundamentally embedded in an ideology of violence that actually does violence by projecting on communities a cognitive framework that is removed from their lived experience, and that does violence through the erasure of the knowledge generating capacities of communities. Now, within this structure then, and this is something I want to point out, is that when we talk decolonization, particularly sitting in South and Southeast Asia, we often talk about the Asian turn. Unfortunately, much of what we do with the Asian turn keeps intact this kind of colonizing framework by turning to techno-deterministic, technology-based forms of capitalist solutions to the kinds of challenges we face in our communities, and failing to look at the kinds of solutions that people are living with or developing at the margins of our societies. So to actually think about the possibilities of climate change and transforming structures, we have to consider how do we decolonize communication, knowledge, and practice. And decolonization in that sense is really about interrogating the interplays of capitalism, democracy, participation that are mediated through technology and the state civil society market mix in order to serve the agendas of global capital, in order to serve the expansive reach of capital. So if we are really talking about addressing climate change, we have to think about ways outside of capital. We have to think about ways in which capitalism can be fundamentally dismantled and reconfigured in order to enable other ways of living and being. So in that sense, then participatory technologies are not just about empowering communities so that they can participate in the market, but participation is fundamentally about developing practical interventions that are emergent from theories from the Global South, that are attentive to the theorizing capacity of people at the margins of the Global South. So not us elites that occupy westernized structures and therefore engage in that modality of mediating the narrative of capital and colonization, but actually turning that capacity in the hands of those at the margins of communities in the Global South. So to address climate change, then we need to think about how communicative inequalities are intertwined with the structural inequalities, and how then do we build infrastructures for representation and recognition through which we can address these broader structural inequalities that constitute climate change. So I want to leave you with a few sets of questions. So when we think about communication as decolonization within the context of climate change, let's ask, how does information and knowledge perpetrate the fundamental inequalities in global organizing. So how is it that we turn to the same white hegemonic structures across the global south to tell us solutions or to send solutions to us in top-down ways, while actually knowing fully well that those ways of living and organizing actually have led us to where we are today with regard to climate change. So we have to ask, who owns information, who owns knowledge, for what purposes, because knowledge is always political, who produces knowledge for what purposes, and what are the subject and object positions in knowledge configurations. And through that process, then we can perhaps be attentive to the erasures in the generation and circulation of knowledge. So if we turn to the idea of communication as listening, listening can provide us perhaps an entry point to disrupting the silences that perpetuate the dominant structures. Listening can provide us perhaps an entry point to imagining alternative social forms of organizing, to alternative political and economic structures that offer us entry points to actually transforming the ways of being that we inhabit today. And listening as a framework for making impure the dominant categories and dominant frameworks of knowledge. So I want to wrap up with this image from the community radio that is run by the women farmers. And one of the things that they say is that if they were to challenge the onslaught of neoliberal agriculture, and that is often proposed to them as solutions within the context of climate change, then they have to actually own ways of storytelling, forms of communication infrastructures, where they can disseminate their knowledge. And that's a real struggle, because so much of the development extension and the corporate infrastructure of communication is taken over by the interests of global capital. So through this community radio, they're able to tell the stories of indigenous agriculture and the innovations of indigenous agriculture. So climate change within this context and adaptation to climate change is fundamentally about protecting the diversity of life forms for the women. It is about safeguarding seed diversity and seed sovereignty through communication sovereignty, ensuring that the communities have what in the Maori word, Tinoranga Tiratanga, refers to the idea of indigenous sovereignty, indigenous ownership of indigenous forms of knowledge production. So I want to leave you with these two excerpts. In one excerpt, the women say, when talking about the seeds that they grow, that, we eat what we grow. And for us to actually grow what we want to grow, we need to protect our seeds, but we also need to protect our knowledge, and we need to safeguard our knowledge from capital. We need to safeguard our knowledge from the reach of financialization that will steal that knowledge. So biopiracy is a real threat. So within that context, sovereignty becomes a way for them to challenge that kind of extraction. In the second example, they talk about how challenging the financial logic that agriculture is to make profit or agriculture is to make money is the way for them to actually resist this large-scale corporatization of agriculture, where they reimagine agriculture as a way to sustain their families, sustain their communities, and ensure that food is in abundance. So, Jan talked about the sustainability development goals. And if you think about zero hunger being one of them, in the knowledge systems generated by the women, the way you get to zero hunger is not through more corporatized neoliberal agriculture with large foundations delivering the solutions through corporatized bodies, but actually through community ownership of forms of knowledge. So in this image, you see the women are moving through the villages, in these processions, carrying the seeds and singing the songs of seeds. And these songs of the seeds for them are the entry points to transformation. So communication in this sense is dialogic, it is inclusive, but it is also directed at dismantling these colonizing processes of whiteness that underline global inequalities. And communication in this sense is about sustaining infrastructures through intergenerational learning and ownership, but it is also about organizing to transform global capitalism and colonialism. I will wrap up with a little bit of an excerpt from this song that is sung by this woman. Here, what you see is that the women are singing to the seeds, and this is one way for them to sustain their knowledge in the backdrop of the ongoing onslaught of colonizing knowledge systems on their communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohan Dutta. You gave me a critical lens in looking at development again, and how we're framing climate change, and how we're framing what should be the responses, and perhaps we should really listen from the indigenous wisdom or people who are marginalized. What do you say? I was overwhelmed by your presentation, and I was telling Ramon, I so love the perspective you have presented. All right, so at this point, I would like to encourage all our participants now to please get into the chat box, kindly write as the questions which you would like to address to Dr. Yan, Sir Jonathan Lin, and to Dr. Mohan. But first off, let me start this one, okay? When one of the issues raised in the COP26 was that it failed to actually give space or allow for participation from many of the developing countries, and that even from indigenous peoples. First, I would like to address perhaps Sir Jonathan about that, although you're not with COP26, but what's your take on the matter? Because they were saying that, well, maybe because of one, the COVID restrictions also prevented them from getting themselves represented. Sir Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks. And not only am I not with COP26 and the Framework Convention, but also the IPCC would not comment on the negotiations themselves. But I was at COP26, because although the IPCC isn't part of the negotiations, we're always there and we present the science to the negotiators and other participants. Yeah, I mean, of course, this was a unique COP, or an unprecedented, after the previous year when it was cancelled altogether because of COVID, and they had very strict processes in place to try and control the spread of the disease, and I think that had an impact on everything. I mean, the negotiations did move along. I mean, I think there was perhaps more of an impact on the participation of the civil society organizations and the governments. As far as I know, all the governments that wanted to be there were there, and the host did make some special arrangements around quarantine and visas to get them there. But there were some problems for civil society organizations, and who have an important effect on informing the negotiations. And of course, there was some as often happens at the COP, but this was particularly the case here, there were some difficulties getting accommodation in Glasgow, and it was quite expensive for some people. But I think the COP met, and the COP produced results, and although the results weren't what everybody was hoping for, there were some quite significant advances there. I thought, as a personal advisor, not an official commentary. I mean, I wouldn't share Professor Yan's evaluation of it as a complete flop. I would say there were, apart from the agreements on the sidelines of the COP, on things like deforestation and methane, I thought there was some encouraging, the fact that we got coal and fossil fuel into the final document for the first time, that's encouraging. So sure, a lot more has to be done, but I think a door's been opened there.
Okay, thank you very much. Because with or without the COP26, each nation should really try their very best to respond to climate change, right? I mean,
Yeah.
on their own. All right. Now I have this first question from Jeff Ragrayo. Okay, I hope I pronounced your last name correctly. It says here, can you please elaborate on the potential of community media in countering the whiteness hegemonic system in the global south? Maybe we'd like to have Dr. Mohan and followed by Dr. Yan to address this, because I believe Dr. Yan's previous articles also mentioned about the global south and the global north. So can we start first with Dr. Mohan?
So for, if you look at communities in the global south, local and indigenous communities, and consider this concept of communication sovereignty, or Tinoranga Tiratanga, how do communities own spaces of knowledge? Communication in that sense becomes the infrastructure, if you will, for owning that knowledge, for sharing that story of that knowledge, as well as for disseminating that knowledge within communities, but also become the basis for building regional, local, subnational, national networks based upon that knowledge. So community media, at least in the work that we have done within the context of Global South, really emerge as tools for interrogating, disrupting the corporate capitalist story, because so much of the media infrastructure is right now in the hands of capital. And those also become ways, therefore, for making particular knowledge claims that can be vital to the kinds of solutions that can be generated to climate change, not just locally, but also regionally and globally.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Mohan. Dr. Yan, would you like to respond to that as well? Your mic, sir. Okay.
Okay, I basically agree with what Mohan said. If he would undo the jargonism involved in his discourse, but I think you'll need to define what are and what is a community media, and then what is the system which dominates in this or that kind of context. And there is, in my research, not much of a difference between community media in the West or in the South or in the North or the East. It's always a matter of contextual analysis. And it has definitely more potential than the mainstream media, and in that sense I agree with Mohan. But how to recommend and transitory or strategic options, that still needs to be be assessed in its particular context. And definitely culture, participation, indigenous perspectives, they do play a major role in all of it.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll get back to you for the next set of questions. This is not a question, but more of a comment, but I'd like to have Sir Jonathan also react to this. She says, it comes from Marlea Muñez. More work is needed for the mainstream science and community-based science to dialogue, converse on climate change. What are your thoughts, Sir Jonathan? More work is needed. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think this is something that Professor Mohan was also looking at in his presentation. And yeah, I mean, certainly there's again, I'm not a professional scientist or academic. I'm speaking purely as a practitioner, but it's clear. Say within the context of the IPCC, one of the big challenges we face is that our mandate is to look at basically at published science and to assess that, present that to policymakers. So how do we ensure then that these other voices in indigenous knowledge, community science, how do we ensure that that is reflected in published science? And that's a big challenge. And we've ourselves have had several workshops on looking at that. And it's not just a case of I mean, let me step back a bit. It's already a challenge for us to ensure that in our author teams, there are plenty of scientists from developing countries, let alone getting into some of the more theoretical aspects that Professor Mohan was discussing. In the report we produced in 2019 on land use, climate change and land, that was the first IPCC report in history where a majority of the authors were from developing countries. So it's still we still have a lot of work to do to ensure that the representation is there. But then going beyond that, because of course many of those authors are working in Western or global North universities and institutions and working in those traditional academic frameworks. How do we then go beyond that to ensure that indigenous knowledge and communities are brought into it? One way, of course, is for scientists in those countries to study what community science and what indigenous knowledge is saying and have that published in the journals, which are then accessible to bodies such as the IPCC. That's one option. There's a lot of work to be done there, but it is very, very important to capture this knowledge so that it's not lost to policymakers when they're developing a comprehensive response.
Mm-hmm. So that's a very good research agenda you post there. All right. I have one other question. Time check. It's 3:30, but I have this one question from Imelda Benitez Domitita. I guess this is addressed to Dr. Yan. I like the idea of SDG number 18, communication for all. I wish to be enlightened on how far this idea has gone in its integration to the current 17 SDGs. Dr. Yan?
Okay, so thanks for the question. Basically, we are currently compiling a couple of volumes on that particular issue. We have always made this argument in some of our statements and publications, but now in the coming months, year maybe, we have the volume or the material to publish a decent book about this. That means that it's not yet accepted at all these policy levels. We have made that argument, we have made that, advocated for that argument in UN and other agencies, but it only reached the level of being noted and sometimes being awarded as okay, good idea, but let's go back to the business of everyday issues first. So to answer the question straightforwardly, I would say there is not much done yet, but we are working on it and we are trying to push for more perspectives which take the 18th communication for all perspective into account. Of course, for those who can't wait, there are already a couple of publications, not only co-authored by myself, but also by others like Philip Lee and Vargas from the WACC, who came up with books and statements along those lines. But to come back to what we were discussing just a minute ago, whether the IPCC or any of these international networks is the right way to advocate for climate change, etc. Up to a point, I'm not saying that you should forget about it. I've myself also worked in UN agency environments for the World Bank and you name it. And I've always considered that not a waste of my time, but having said so, I think there are more important ways of advocating and lobbying for change, and that's more along the lines of what Mohan Dutta was indicating. Although we may disagree on the specific strategic implications of this or that, but I think we need to start at the, so to speak, at the grassroots level and mobilize and empower people to the extent that real change can take place. And I have my doubts about another statement at the COP27 level saying that then this or that will be changed by 2050 or something. It's all a matter of finding the right words and terminologies to keep people happy and to go back to their business at home. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Time check, it's 9:34, but I probably would have a minute and a half for each one of you to finally communicate once again what you wish to stress in with regards communicating climate change. Or unless you want to respond to this question, does World Trade Organization even recognize global warming? And as Sir Lee was mentioning, that even in the social media right now, we notice that there's an active move to suppress discussions about climate change. Can we start with Dr. Dutta, then we'll have Sir Jonathan, and then Dr. Yan?
Great. In short, I think that we really need to think about the ways in which we can decolonize existing political, economic, social practices, which continue to perpetuate inequalities of knowledge production and which lie at the heart of expelling communities from their livelihood, extracting resources, and perpetuating this growth-driven monolithic model of exploitation that lies at the heart of addressing climate change. And I just want to say that decolonization, however, does not mean Asian turn. If we look closely at Asia, we see ample examples, the ways in which within Asia, we continue to perpetuate extractive practices, be it in the form of one belt, one road, spanning across Asia and the kinds of expulsions that is creating, be it in the form of Singapore's development, meaning stealing sand from neighboring countries, or be it in the form of India's development, meaning the Adani Corporation expanding its mining operations among indigenous communities in Asia. So we also need to be very critical of what the turn to Asia looks like. And decolonization, to me, in that sense, is really about rethinking and undoing the kinds of unsustainable practices that have led us to where we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dutta. Dr. Yan? I'm sorry, I said, Sir Lin, I'm sorry. My apologies. Sir Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you. It's a big question. We could have a whole conference on that alone. But I think the important thing is, though there are some broad global messages and some general facts that need to be communicated, when every community that we speak to has its own specifics, and when we're talking about climate change, we should make sure that we understand the particular regional and social context of that community and that group and its values, and speak in those terms, not in abstract terms and using jargon and science, but really trying to relate it to their lived life and how they can be empowered and how they can be empowered to deal with the problem and not have a problem imposed, a solution imposed them from outside, but how they in their community can work with it and have the sort of authorship of agency to deal with it.
Thank you so much. Dr. Yan?
Yeah, this indeed needs a longer discussion and probably another conference, but the case that we are in the Asia context, I would also remind ourselves, and Mohan uses the term decolonization, that Asia is currently on the way to anti-democratic and authoritarian regimes rather than democratic and participatory systems. So it's a real worry for us today to see how this is being implemented and promoted in context, political, economic, and otherwise. We as communication scholars should also look at ourselves, and I've already indicated in my presentation that I'm not so pleased or convinced that a lot what's happening in communication research is the way forward. I've sometimes jokingly used the percentage that 80 to, let's say, 90% of what's going on in communication research is wasted from a perspective of sustainability and good social change and climate change perspectives. So we should also have a good look at ourselves and do some soul searching and maybe being more self-critical to what we are doing, including myself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jan Servais, Dr. Manduta, and Sir Jonathan Lin for your inputs this afternoon. Definitely, you have enriched our learning and understanding of not just climate change, but considering all other factors, the holistic approach to understanding what's happening in our society right now. With that, we cap this session and may please invite everyone else to kindly proceed to the various plenary sessions, and may we request all our speakers to please stay behind as we shall have our photo taking. Thank you very much, everyone, and it's been a pleasant day for us as we have heard from these distinguished fellows we've had this afternoon. On behalf of AMIC, this is Lisa Abanto. Thank you very much.